I have been so lucky throughout my life. And specifically, one of those ways is that fact that I had some exposure to architecture early in my life and found a passion for it. Did not have to seek for my passion, right? I didn't have to study 10 things in college to discover what I might like to do in my career. Again, I was not, I never felt constraints. I never felt like, oh, I'm a girl, I can't be good at math. Never felt that in my life. When I hear that, and I hear that to this day, I get so frustrated and I just want to, take the girl and show her how good she is at math. Like I'm determined, to do that. So being young and naive, probably at the age of 12, I think I thought I could do things better than some people, even though I'm 12 years old. So I saw
you probably could
what architects were doing. And I was like, well, I could make that look better, silly 12-year-old. But, I have that kind of like, I'm not intimidated, I'm empowered kind of feeling about me.
This is Christine, a registered architect and married mother of 3. At 10 years old, Christine knew she wanted to become an architect. In middle school, she added a love of art and math to her passions. In an advanced drafting class in high school, she was designing buildings. And after earning her architecture degree at USC, she landed a job with one of the top architecture design firms in the United States. It's an amazing story. And yet, like every story, there are deeper motifs: a supportive family, an unwavering self-confidence, a willingness to explore compromises, to be the best professional wife and mother she can be, all while continuing her lifelong passion for architecture and design. Join me in my conversation with Christine. I'm your host, Mark Good, and this is Remarkable, a podcast focused on people and stories worthy of your attention. And now, today's show. Welcome to another episode of my Remarkable podcast, and I'm delighted to greet Christine. And I need you to pronounce your last name again. I want to say Medvedev.
That's perfectly fine.
Okay.
Christine Medvedev.
Medvedev. There we go.
Either way is great.
All right. Wonderful. Christine, what we want to talk about in today's episode is really kind of the story arc of how you came from a home and a family in New Jersey, went to the West Coast to go to school in architecture, right? A great school, USC. And then back to the East Coast, where you practiced and continue to practice architecture. And of course, now you're in the Midwest, we would say, upper Midwest. Want to talk a little bit about that because as we were talking off mic a little bit beforehand, I find it interesting that you went to school, grade school, high school, and so forth, graduated, if I understand correctly, at the age of 17, right? But at that point in your life, you had already made the decision to become an architect. And I think of myself at the age of 17, and my principal concerns were I wanted to buy a car. There was a girl that I was dating. I mean, I was not thinking, I couldn't even conceive of career, right? And yet you went through this process, and here you are as a registered architect with a major focus in sustainability. And yet what's interesting is that this is not at all a surprise when I look at the trajectory of your life thus far. This is a part of an arc of a story, right?
Sure.
And I would love for us to talk about that because I think there are people that are listening, one who maybe are thinking about where am I in my career or in my studies, right?
Yeah.
Who would draw some guidance and perhaps inspiration from those choices.
Right.
And I think there's others who are just going to be interested in the arc. So let's start with life in New Jersey.
Life in New Jersey.
Right?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Mark. This is exciting. I'm very happy to be here. If I start from the beginning, life in New Jersey, I consider myself extremely lucky. I have been so lucky throughout my life. And specifically, one of those ways is that fact that I had some exposure to architecture early in my life and found a passion for it. Did not have to seek for my passion, right? I didn't have to study 10 things in college to discover what I might like to do in my career.
Which is so many people's story.
Yes, and that's totally fine. As Jerry Seinfeld said, not that there's anything wrong with that, right? But so I know I'm not normal in that way. And I don't want my story to come across as, in any way preachy as this is what you should do, because I do think that was a very unique situation. And it is very common for architects, such as myself, to know when they're even 10 years old, or it could be from the time that they could remember, to know that they're passionate about architecture. The hard part is, of course, well, what does that mean? How do you translate that into your career and incorporate that into your life, right? There are many challenges there. So it is interesting to me that many architects find that passion early. It helps if there's some exposure to it, and I did have that exposure, and that's why I'm lucky. So
talk about that a little bit.
So for me, it was very simple. My parents started renovating our house when I think I was 8 or 9 years old.
Okay.
And we lived there during the renovation.
Right.
And it was massive. I saw construction every day from a young age. I was fascinated by it, and I also wasn't intimidated by it. And that's also, so the not being intimidated is partially personality, but also partially environmental, right? I grew up with parents who empowered me. I had no reason to think I couldn't do something. So if you're passionate about it, therefore you can do it, right? That's not where many people are coming from necessarily.
Were you an only child?
Oh, no. I'm one of 3. I'm the middle child.
The wonderful middle child.
Oh, yes, and all that entails. To me, that just meant, I had to be my own person, right? I didn't want to be defined by any other person. I, didn't have whatever the expectations are of an older child. I didn't have that. I certainly did have expectations.
Right.
It was always a given, fortunately.
Right.
And again, I go back to I'm lucky in life. It was a given that I would go to college. Not once did I or my parents ever consider that I would not. So if you have that given and you have passion, therefore that's like a basic equation, right? For you have the wings to go do this, right? And then, so I had some exposure to that. My father is and to this day, he loves building things. He's not a builder by trade. He's, had a career in finance and entrepreneurship, but on weekends.
But you are in some respects your father's daughter.
Oh, yeah.
As an architect, and
yes.
he is a passion for building.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, he would build things like, he would build a new deck. When they needed a new deck, he would build the deck.
Right.
He would build like fancy things for the garage. He wasn't building houses with his own hands, but he was just very handy. So he had all the tools. He would just build stuff. Like, you need something, I'm going to go build it.
Right.
And I saw that, right? So the basics were like already ingrained in my mind. I knew from a young age, you could take 2 pieces of wood and you could make it look like whatever you wanted it to look like. It could be functional and it could be beautiful. And that was ingrained in me from day one, basically.
Wow.
So after that, my parents renovated that house. They also built a house separately from that. So that was, again, additional exposure and things like floor plans. These were hand-drawn blueprints for an entirely new home. I could look at those and I could look at these lines on a page and visualize it. And I learned what all of those lines mean. And the organization
Right.
of the drawings.
Right.
Kind of from a young age. I didn't learn all the technical aspects, obviously, at that young of an age. That comes much later. But, the basics of I'm looking at a floor plan. I'm looking at an elevation. What does that mean? Right? Also, the organization of a project. There's a client. The client hires an architect. They put the drawings out for bid. They get many prices from different contractors. They choose a contractor. The contractor builds it, and the architect has to be involved to make sure that it's being built the way that they specified that it should be. So I learned those basics just growing up by just being the daughter of my parents.
Wow.
That's it.
Wow.
So I was very lucky. Then I would say by the end of, by middle school, really, I was already, I loved art, but I also loved math. Again, I was not, I never felt constraints. I never felt like, oh, I'm a girl, I can't be good at math. Never felt that in my life. When I hear that, and I hear that to this day, I get so frustrated and I just want to, take the girl and show her how good she is at math. Like I'm determined, to do that. So anyway, and those, biases do exist. Oh, I'm a girl, I can't do math. That's not right. There's nothing different about our brains that says we can't do math. And by the way, to be an architect, you don't have to be like a PhD level mathematician. You have to know the basics really well and have a good sense for physics. That's about it. But I had that love of math and also a love of art and a love of things that are beautiful in our environment. I was fortunate enough to be able to travel. And I think what that does is, even if you can only travel locally, like if you were born in Shaker Heights, Ohio, and you could only travel in Ohio or maybe to Pennsylvania, you could see Frank Lloyd Wright homes. You could see
what is that? Falling Water?
Falling Water in Pennsylvania.
Right.
Truth be told, and maybe this makes me, a bad architect. I don't know what the local Frank Lloyd Wright projects are, if there are any in Ohio. I'm sure there are some, but I'll blame that on being newish to Ohio. But, you could see Falling Water in Pennsylvania, not that far away. You could see a geodesic dome. I think it's 45 minutes.
I've seen that.
East.
Yep.
You can see skyscrapers downtown. Right. You can see urban planning.
Well,
you can see beautiful things.
Even urban planning circa 1910 here in Shaker.
Yes.
Which was groundbreaking at the time, right?
Yes. And you can see modern urban planning. You can see what Land Studio's doing, at Irish Town Bend. You can see the art museum. You could the new Natural History Museum. So there's great architecture everywhere. I do think traveling just gave me like a broad perspective of sort of what's possible, and that, things don't have to look the same. Like if you grow up in a place and that's all you see, you think this is what a house looks like. This is what a building looks like. And I didn't have that from travel. But
it almost seems like, as I'm listening to you, your stories, it's interesting. It's kind of cumulative. So you had this experience as a 8 or 9-year-old in your parents' home as they're remodeling, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's another home. You watch that whole design process.
Yep.
And then in school, you're nurturing this love of art and math, right?
Yes.
At what point did those sort of passions and experience begin to bring into focus this idea of architecture?
Good question. Yeah. So being young and naive, probably at the age of 12, I think I thought I could do things better than some people, even though I'm 12 years old. So I saw
you probably could
what architects were doing, and I was like, well, I could make that look better, silly 12-year-old. But, I have that kind of like, I'm not intimidated, I'm empowered kind of feeling about me. And so then my parents decided to send us to Pingree, which is this independent school in New Jersey, certainly an amazing place. Pingree had a freshman level drafting and design course. Actually, there were 2 courses. I think it was drafting 1 was freshman level, and then there was drafting 2 and design, or drafting 2 and architecture was maybe the second level.
And when you say freshman, you're talking about freshmen in high school.
Yes, freshman in high school at Pingree. So I started there when I was in 9th grade, and I took that course with Mrs. Svedman, who has since retired. But, she let us really be creative, but also like kept it technical in a way.
This is your drafting course.
This is my drafting course as a freshman in high school.
But taught by a female.
Taught by a female, yes,
right.
Mrs. Fedman.
Which I think is important because many people, again, with, gender biases, might have assumed that the drafting course would be taught by a man, right?
Sure. That never even occurred to me. But yes, we all have those biases.
Yeah. So you've got a female drafting instructor.
Yes.
And I interrupted your flow.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah. So no, we did really creative things. And it was not like, it was designed to not be the real world yet, which is great. And, the real world doesn't hit obviously until you're, in terms of architecture and design, it doesn't hit until you're really out of college.
Right.
Even college with all of the rigor of an architecture program, they're still hypothetical projects, basically. So anyway, Mrs. Fedman's drafting class, we did technical things like lettering, which does not exist today, right? Learned how to write perfect letters in all uppercase, which is what you had to do on a set of blueprints. Learned how to draft by hand. But we did very creative things.
So I need you to write my name sometime like an architect because there is a distinctive architectural style.
Right? Oh, yes. Well, I still do mostly all caps, but I'm a little schizophrenic when it comes to that. Like my paper right here, I write all caps and then I just scribble something. But anyway, so we did a really cool project where it was just totally hypothetical and creative. Like we each individually wrote down our kind of dream list of a property that we wanted to design. And it could have a home or some other building on it.
Right.
But as a class, we had to piece all of these properties together.
Oh, interesting.
So Joey over here wants beachfront, but Sally wants mountain lake and a cliff,
Right.
So how are you to piece this all together? And we made a massive physical model of this giant property with all of our little buildings on it.
How cool is that?
Yeah, we're freshmen in high school. It was so cool.
Wow.
So layered up cardboard to make all the topography. And then, of course, again, the technical things. We learned, okay, if you're looking down at that property, what do the topographic lines look like? Right? How do you draw that on a plan?
That's amazing.
It was incredible. Yes. So I don't know that course still exists today. And I know that, for example, Shaker schools do have design. I don't think they're doing specific, architectural design like that, though, necessarily.
I would, and this is purely assumption on my part because I've never taken courses like that, but I would assume that a lot of it would be computer-based. What I find fascinating is that you were then asked or required to do a full 3D model, which moves it out of
a physical model, not a computer model. Yes,
right, exactly.
Yes. So, which I think was, honestly, I think that's how it should be done today for learning. Of course, there's going to be computers involved. I'm not saying we need to all do hand drafting, but to physically see what you're producing is key. And I believe in college, in architecture school, you're still producing physical models, which is excellent. But anyway, so yes, at that time it was all manual. We did not use computers at that point. I didn't start using AutoCAD. I think MicroCAD existed maybe in like 95, something like that. I
haven't heard those names in forever.
By like the late 90s, there was AutoCAD.
Right.
So that was transformational, obviously. I find that one of the most frustrating things today, though, is that all of these programs that exist today, to me, when you print it out, sometimes it's not technically right in terms of the drafting.
Interesting.
Like the extension lines of the dimension are not consistent or they're overlapping in a way. So I do feel like there's a lack of appreciation for what it should look like.
Right.
However that's achieved, if it's hand drawn, if it's obviously today it's going to be computer drawn, but using whatever program, to me it should still be technically right in order to be a correct like architectural set of drawings.
Right.
But anyway, that's a different rant, I guess. Anyway, so I did that at Pingree, those two courses. We didn't get much into like theory or history. But later on, I took courses like art history. I took AP art history. And at Pingree. And that was a really tough class for me. It was a double period AP class. The art aspect, honestly, it's wonderful. I felt overworked, and all I wanted to focus on at that point was architecture. So I would say, okay, what aspects of this art history class, like what is architectural? And at least let me focus on that. At least let me do well on that part. I think that the downside of kind of knowing what you want to do in your career early on is that all of the exploration that can happen sometimes doesn't. I think in my case, it didn't happen to some extent. I could have appreciated that AP art history class more had I not been so focused on architecture and just looking for the architectural pieces, right? I took microeconomics. I remember supply and demand. Like that's, it's probably about it. I in college. So going back to this arc, right? So I'm already focused on architecture at that point.
Right.
And those classes did really solidify that. Those classes at Pingree definitely solidified that. I knew that there was an artistic component that I wanted to incorporate, and that therefore it wouldn't be structural engineering or something like that. I knew that designing and the creative process was certainly part of it. So it wasn't just, being a builder.
Right.
So that to me is the way that the left brain and the right brain could come together in like the perfect world. That's architecture to me. And I still feel that way. So yes, it's an arc, but it's like a very direct path for me, because I feel that we can affect the lives of every human being on this planet and the environment itself directly through architecture. That's what I know. That's what I think I'm at least decent at. So that is the path that I will choose. I like other things in life. There's other things that I care about, but can I affect the world in a positive way through, the fact that I like to cook? No. That would not be a good career for me. This is a way that I can both affect the world in a positive way, again, and enjoy what I'm doing in the process. So when it's a passion, it just, fortunately for me, kind of fell into place in that way. So then I had to get into college.
I was going to say, how did you go from Pingree, which is New Jersey, to USC's School of Architecture?
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a bigger deal now, especially because I have, my oldest being 10 years old. If he told me he wanted to go to, Singapore for college or something, I'd say, oh my God. So I don't quite know what my parents were thinking really, but what I was thinking was, I want to study architecture. Right. So I specifically applied to 5-year architecture programs. You get a Bachelor of Architecture degree from a 5-year professional architecture program. And there are not that many of them across the country. I had been to California, I want to say, a few times. I looked at and did apply to some East Coast schools, and I was considering going to upstate New York. And they're very excellent schools up there. My other choice was Syracuse. And I also applied to Rensselaer, and I could have gone to either of those. Frankly.
Because I would think an RPI would have been a choice.
Rensselaer, and my good friend's father had gone to Rensselaer. So it was in the running, and I visited. Of course, I visited, and it was a snowstorm. In Troy, New York.
Well, and given that, who wouldn't pick California?
Yeah. And I kind of was like, you know what? I just want to go do something different. I was excited about the design happening in California. To me, it was like this creative, different, cool place. And there were very different things happening there. I really can't speak to it now. I haven't practiced there professionally. So, I don't quite know what's going on. Certainly New York has always been, a hub of design as well. But anyway, in California at that time, there was definitely some more avant-garde, innovative work happening, specifically in Southern California. So that sounded cool to me. I actually went to a summer program there. The summer, I forget if it was before my junior year or before my senior year, but I did like I want to say it was a 4-week summer in architecture program.
Right.
That was sort of like, if you think you want to do architecture, it was recommended to do that program, and many schools have them. And if you did not want to go into architecture, you would find out in that program, because it was immersive enough that you would then apply somewhere else if you didn't love it. So for me, that just solidified it. Again, I already knew that I wanted to be in architecture, but I did that program at USC. So that was a good kind of trial. Can I handle being on the opposite coast for my family? My family was supportive and amazing. Again, I'm very lucky in that regard. My father had some business on the West Coast at that time, so he was on the West Coast regularly, like at least, it could have been every other week, at least once a month for the first few years that I was in school there. So I actually would see my dad kind of frequently there.
That's cool.
Which was fun. So anyway, yeah, USC. I tell people, architecture school is not for everyone. The downside is that it is very focused. So if you want to study a lot of different interesting things and like explore the world, architecture school makes it a little bit harder to do that. Now, again, I had done some traveling before, but many of the architecture schools have study abroad programs. So I would highly encourage someone, if they can do that, to have that experience in architecture school, to see the different things that are possible. So I spent a semester in France, which was amazing in architecture school. But again, if I don't mean to dwell on the negative, but I would say the downside is that, I was at USC. I had access to amazing resources, classes, faculty, fellow students there, being in Los Angeles, just so many opportunities. And I was really focused on architecture. So I took a geology class. It was a general education requirement. And I was so interested in it. It was so cool. We went out to see the San Andreas Fault. It was great. I think, I passed. I probably just passed because I was so focused on architecture. And I don't know if the culture has changed. At that point, the culture in architecture school was really, it was just very rigorous and almost in an unhealthy way. So it was very normalized to not sleep. It was normalized to get some pillows and sleep under your desk if you had to.
It almost sounds like med school when I
possibly
talk to people.
I have no experience outside of architecture school, so I can't compare. But
the intensity of the studying and the focus.
I unfortunately, I had friends who got prescriptions for things that they didn't have any sort of disorder that would warrant this prescription, but they would get a prescription for something that would make them focus.
Yeah.
Essentially.
A lot of people in college do that. I think what's helpful to remember, certainly I have a liberal arts background, so I tend to be I'm not a polymath, but I have a lot of interest, right? That kind of wide-ranging interest in all kinds of things. But architecture is a discipline and a career that's, you're designing things that people will live in, occupy, work in, etc. And there's a lot of detail associated with getting it right.
Yes, there is.
Including
the historical context, right? If you have to learn thousands of years of architectural history to inform what you're going to then do and make it safe.
Yeah, it's got to be safe. It's got to be affordable. It's got to be sustainable. There's a lot of disciplines that are involved in designing something. Most people don't understand that. It's really complex. So it doesn't surprise me to learn, and this is my first time to learn this, that architecture school was that focused and was that intense in order for you to graduate and, become enabled to become a registered architect.
Yes.
So I get that. I think most people who've not given that a lot of thought don't understand all that's involved in becoming an architect. But you made your way through school, and it sounds like, as the British would say, you had blinkers on. You were like totally focused on getting your degree.
Yes. Well, I was in Los Angeles too, so I had some fun along the way.
Yeah, that'll be a separate podcast.
Yeah, sure.
But no, I didn't mean to be dismissive. I'm sure it would be fascinating.
No. It would not be. It would not. But that's okay.
So you graduated.
Sure.
Why come back to the East Coast? I mean,
yeah. I think there's some cultural. To me, there were some differences.
Right.
You know, coming from. I grew up in suburbs of New York City.
Right.
I think we're all biased based on where we grow up. And when I went to Los Angeles, Hollywood culture and everyone emulating Hollywood culture. And by everyone, I mean like even like poor students.
Right.
Or like people who have like no business, you know, spending money on things to emulate Hollywood culture. Like that's just normal there.
Right.
Now, this is a long time ago too. This is, 1998. I went to college. Today, we're so much more global, possibly everyone is emulating Hollywood culture. But at that time, I think it was a little bit different. Certain things just didn't make sense to me in Los Angeles. I was used to the grittiness of New York, the realness, the bluntness. That didn't translate in Los Angeles, really. And my bubble world of fellow students at Los Angeles was wonderful. I didn't have exposure to the professional world in Los Angeles. So this is just based on what I saw or how I perceived the world outside of USC, I think. But certain things were reflected in our day-to-day lives as students. So actually, one year I lived on Shrine Place, down the street from the Shrine Auditorium where the Oscars used to be held. And they were held at that time while I was living there. And I cannot tell you how everyone's lives, we're students. I'm in architecture school. I don't care about the Oscars, frankly. I was trying to finish my project at architecture school. The way that the world would revolve around that was so unfathomable to me. I just couldn't understand it. And it seemed to be accepted by the city as a whole and kind of ingrained in how the city is run. That is just acceptable. No one may park in, a half a mile radius of the Shrine Auditorium for however many days leading up to it. And I know that sounds petty, but I was just like fundamentally in conflict with that. This Hollywood thing.
Well, the Hollywood, the film industry is in many cases, and I say this anecdotally and as just a casual observer, but it seems like it's a big part of the financial heartbeat of the city.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yes.
So it is understandable
they
to
could
me.
afford to do that 100%.
And it's what makes the city run. I don't want to say
Yes.
the city, but
Yes.
a lot of the city run.
Yes.
Right.
I saw it, though, at that it was at the expense of students
Oh, interesting.
sometimes. So I saw my friends who couldn't afford to go get their car out of the impound lot. One time they were filming on campus, not infrequently. It was like a regular thing for there to be filming at USC. Wonderful campus. I'm not trying to knock it, but they decide to film. They put up some signs. Oh, your car was there. It's towed. And it was like the sign wasn't even there.
Right.
The night before when they parked.
Right.
Your car's towed. These are like poor students.
Right.
Woe is me, it's USC. I know the acronym, people say in a funny way, University of Spoiled Children. My friends at USC were not spoiled children. They mostly had loans and, were either working through college if they could manage to have the time,
Right.
or would just have giant amounts of debt afterwards.
Right.
So could they afford to, when they get out of architecture studio at 4:00 in the morning to go get their car from the impound lot? No. Or have the boot removed that they used to do. So I just saw things that to me, the world didn't make sense as much. It's a driving place, so much traffic. I also had this idealistic view of New York City. and that's what I wanted to get back to. My sister was a year ahead of me in school, so she, also knew that she wanted to get to New York City, and that was kind of like, became our plan. We were gonna move to New York City, and she started off a year before me there. And when I graduated USC, I did not have a job yet, but I wasn't worried because that's my personality, I guess. I just said, you know what? I'm going to move back. I'm going to get a job. It's all going to be good. And thank God.
You did get a job.
It did get a job.
And it all worked out.
And it worked out.
It's
amazingly.
It's
amazing when the universe agrees. Again, I'm very lucky and I keep knocking on wood. But anyway, I moved home and I ended up getting a job at Gensler, which is an amazing architecture firm. It's one of the largest firms in the United States, if not the world. Was extremely lucky to get a job there, working at their office, which was on Wall Street at the time. The main office was in Midtown, but I was at the Wall Street office. I did happen to connect with a high school alum who worked there. So again, luck.
Wow.
Luck and connections.
A Pingree alum.
A Pingree alum. I do not downplay this to people. Life is networking and connections. I have never been good at that until very recent years, actually, really since moving to Ohio. I sort of now, I appreciate, wow, I know all these amazing people and I need to do a much better job of keeping in touch with people and reaching out to people, talking to people and,
right.
Professionally and just for the enrichment of life, sort of, it's not, to be strategic. It's really just for enrichment. It makes life better. But anyway, at that time, I didn't know anything about networking, but I did happen to see that this alum worked at the New York City office of Gensler. And I was like, oh my gosh, that was so out of my league. I was not a straight A student because I was so focused on architecture. Again, I got a C in geology, as I've already established. But I was passionate about architecture, and I think that came through. And I was very driven in that space. I had done well in architecture, at least at USC. So I had a good portfolio. In those days, you had to have, a printed portfolio to carry around. So I got that job at Gensler, and I was there for almost 7 years. And that was an incredible time of learning and gaining experience.
So you got to Gensler in what, 03?
Oh, yes. I started January, so 04 when I moved into New York City, fortunately, which was amazing.
Did you live in the city itself?
Yes.
Yes. I spent a lot of time there in the 90s raising money. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people, where I came from in Dallas, they would badmouth the East Coast and badmouth New York City.
Yeah.
I found there to be such an energy to that place.
Oh, yeah. I mean, absolutely. That was why I had to be be
Yeah.
It was just...
Because I'm contrasting that to your LA experience.
Yes.
Right? And New York has such an energy to it, just in the people you meet, in the businesses, in the just walking on the streets.
Absolutely. I loved that aspect of it. I mean, you could just being on the subway, there's amazing people all over. Right. There's so much going on. It was sort of you could compare it to Las Vegas in the sense of anything goes. You could sort of do anything almost at any time of day.
Right.
My sister and I, so we lived together. And I remember if there was a snowstorm in the city, that was the best time to go to any restaurant that you ever wanted to go to but couldn't get into.
Right.
You could just walk in, you'd go in your hiking boots and your snow pants, but you could go to any restaurant in the snowstorm. Yeah. That was cool. Anyway, again, extremely lucky to have those years at Gensler. I did make it through several, up and down turns. 2008 was the big one.
Oh, yeah.
Made it through that. That was a very tough time. A lot of people got laid off. I was still, I was fairly junior. I was a few years in at that point. Well, 5 years in, 4 or 5 years in at that point. So still fairly junior. I think just being not highly paid probably helped me, convince them, to keep me. A lot of people got laid off. It's a very tough time. So, and there was it's not like they could go somewhere else. There was no work in that space in commercial architecture. And we were mostly doing commercial interiors, which meant that we were doing fit outs of buildings, New York City being largely, and it's mostly an already built environment. So, we're constantly turning over what's happening inside of all of these buildings. And that's what I was doing at Gensler. It's constantly changing out office space, essentially, but had some good projects too. Did some work for marketing firms, which was exciting. Got to incorporate interesting branding elements and fun design aspects that otherwise, would maybe not have been so exciting.
So how did you go from Gensler to now entrepreneurial sole practitioner?
Naivete. I don't know. Self-sabotage? No, I'm just kidding. So the Gensler to me was a very high standard, and that was wonderful. I was ready to meet that or exceed it. I was up to the challenge. Honestly, when I started thinking about having children, I saw women working there who had children. And in my perception, that was a very tough situation.
Right.
If you weren't living in Manhattan, which I forget if we had already left Manhattan, but we did not, at this point I was married. My husband and I did not want to live in Manhattan. We were like, we need to get out of here.
Right.
We don't want to hear our neighbors anymore, So commuting into Manhattan while having children, and I was like at that age where I was starting to think about that and wanted to have children, that sounded miserable to me. And I saw people doing that, women. I thought the women were miserable.
Right.
I really did. I didn't think the men were miserable at all. I don't think they were, but I think the women were miserable. Now, maybe they weren't. Again, this was my perception at the time. I saw that as a very difficult life, and I did not want to do that. And I saw myself as having options. Again, I'm the ultimate optimist who feels empowered that I can, do what I want and I'm going to make it work.
Right.
So yes, there was some naivete in that, but also, I had options. I had a husband. Having someone to, navigate life with is empowering also.
Yeah.
So we actually both quit our jobs at the same time and traveled the world for 3 or 4 months. Wow. Which was amazing, to get that opportunity when you're, what were we, 30? When we were 30 years old.
Right.
Most people don't have the opportunity to take that kind of break just from working, when you're 30 years old. But we both left our jobs. He actually was going to, had applied to and was going to go to Boston to get a PhD. He had already gone to Harvard for a master's degree. He was going back to do a PhD. He wanted to get into academia and get out of the Wall Street finance world. I said, you know what, I can do anything. I'm going to leave Gensler. I was talking to the Gensler Boston office and thought, I could consider trying to transfer. I wanted to keep my options open, but I wasn't passionate about it. Again, naivete. I just wanted to go out and do my own thing.
Sure.
And I wanted the flexibility. I knew my husband did not have flexibility in his day-to-day life. Being in finance, being on Wall Street, there was no flexibility. We had, just a regular occurrence was I had a friend get married on Lake Como in Italy. We were all set to go. Everything's paid for and booked. Last minute, he can't go. That was like a regular thing because of whatever deal they're working on.
Oh, yeah. So
I knew if I was going to have children, I needed flexibility. And commuting into Manhattan and having being 100% dependent on a nanny to work for, from 8 a.m. latest to 6 or 7 p.m. earliest every day. That sounded terrible to me.
It's not a life.
Yeah. Many people do it, and that's perfectly wonderful. I, commend them for making that work. That's amazing. That's not what I wanted. I wanted to see my kids. I didn't even have them at the time, but I thought, my idea of family life is that, sometimes I would see my kids, right?
Right.
At least, I didn't know if I would want to be 100% career or, stay at home mom. I had no idea. I always thought there would be some kind of mix. And to me, the only way of making, quote, some kind of mix work was to have my own business.
Right.
Now, that is not necessarily what I would recommend for people today. Today's a different world, right? COVID was, terrible, but also a blessing. We now have remote working. We have the world has changed greatly since then. We have flexibility. We don't say maternity leave. We say parental leave because, a dad might want to take, I don't know, a week or two off,
Sure.
after a baby is born.
Sure.
That was not commonplace still when I was, this was around 2010. At that point, it still wasn't commonplace. So at least not in New York, not in the environment that I was in and that my husband was in, certainly. So that was why I started my own business, for flexibility and the feeling that I can do it on my own. So.
Well, as I think back to your past, you talked about your dad being entrepreneurial.
Mm-hmm.
Again, there's an element in which you are your father's daughter, both from the standpoint of your passion for building, designing, etc., like your dad, right?
Yeah.
And then entrepreneurial, like your father. Right?
Yeah.
It takes a certain kind of personality to be able to live with the uncertainty associated with entrepreneurial life, because there's a lot of uncertainty there.
Yeah.
It helps if you have a partner whose income and job can provide some certainty.
Absolutely.
Right? So you can kind of blend those two, which is wonderful.
And it's a partnership, right? I think people have to see it that way. Both women and men have to see it that way, right? Or whoever is in the partnership.
Right.
Partners have to see each other as both giving and taking.
Yep.
Throughout their partnership.
Right.
It may mean at some point you give more and at other points I give more.
Right.
I think too often women especially see it as their own responsibility to kind of figure that out and navigate that. So they see, they look at, let's say my salary is $50,000 a year and I'm working at a large architecture firm. And if I have, one or two kids and that's my salary, and they look at, okay, what is the cost of childcare? And let's say they're both in preschool. Mm-hmm. That's going to probably eat up, after taxes, that's going to kind of be your whole salary, probably, right, for preschool. But women don't think of it as a long-term investment also. And they, we sell ourselves short and we limit our own options, I think, too frequently.
So if you were talking, and I know you do, both at Pingree as well as here in Shaker, to people who are, 15, 16, 17 years old, thinking about careers.
Yes.
Looking back at the arc of your own career, what sort of guidance do you give?
I think that there is a level of exploration that should happen in high school and possibly before. I don't know if that's truly happening in schools. I'm sure in some it is. For me, again, I was lucky to happen to discover something.
Right.
I think that oftentimes, especially students who are ambitious, are so focused on checking off the right courses that they have to take, get to the highest math,
right?
Taking whatever the AP or the honors is. Really, I think it would probably behoove students to consider what do they like more than what they should take.
Right.
What are they actually interested in?
Right.
Now, of course, if they can do some of that exploration, ideally over the summer. Don't waste your summer. Use your summer to see if you can explore, even if it's through reading. There's YouTube now. I didn't have that, right?
Right.
But explore to find what you are passionate about. The worst case is you find nothing and you're in the same situation, right? It's like nothing will have been lost. But I think if you can find what you're passionate about, that just makes your trajectory so much easier to map out. Otherwise, how do you pick a college? How do you pick so many things in life without an idea of what you love and what you like to do.
Right.
And if you can find that, the amazing thing is that that's what you want to do. You don't wake up and say, oh, geez, I got to go, to this office and this is terrible and I got to go do this thing, right? Just sounds terrible to have to work every day of your life for the rest of your life until you can retire, right? But, if you find what you love to do, you can genuinely love your career and want to do it and do it in some capacity throughout your life. You don't have to retire when you're 60 or 65 or 70 years old.
Right.
If I want to practice architecture when I'm 75 years old, well, frankly, as long as someone's willing to pay me or if I can essentially pay myself, I can still practice to some degree.
Sure.
Right? Doesn't have to be 50 hours a week.
Right.
I think that's amazing, to just be able to do something continuously that doesn't have this like expiration date of, I have to stop because, either it's too stressful or you can't do it, I mean, of course, there's physical and mental limitations that are very real that, could happen. But other than those, it's a wonderful thing to be able to do what you love.
It is a wonderful thing. And it's clear from this discussion that you love architecture. I love the, what I call sort of the impulse that you have. It's not only to be creative, but as you've talked about, it's to have a positive impact in the world around us,
Definitely.
to leave the world a better place. And one of the things I heard you say is that architecture is something that allows me to have a positive impact in the world around me, to do good.
Yeah.
And I think that's a wonderful thing. It's not just, not that there's anything wrong with being financially motivated. That's extremely important. We have to feed ourselves, right? And it's also appropriate and important in our economy that we be, compensated for adding value, so that's all a good thing, right? But it's also wonderful to find a way, as you have in architecture, to leave a positive mark on this world. And to make the world a better place through design, which is marvelous because there's virtue in that. And I think a life that is lived virtuously is one that, like a rock hitting a pond, there's ripples of goodness that go far and wide as a consequence of that choice to say, I want to make a positive impact in the world around me, right? And then, as you said in the other podcast episode that we recorded, you talked about being a good steward of the resources that we have on this planet, how important that is. And again, that's a virtuous thing, to be a good steward. There's not a lot of people to talk about. I mean, we live in a very consumptive society. I mean, 2/3 of our economy is driven through personal consumption, right?
I think part of that is there's some education and knowledge, right? If I hadn't read that book, The Story of Stuff by Annie Leonard, I wouldn't know that.
Sure.
And I could just if I just didn't have that in my brain, I could operate differently and still be a virtuous person, right? It's like if I have that in my brain, though, it has to change my behavior in a way.
Well, it does, but also
what I do.
You've made the choice, having read the book, to bring the lessons home.
Yeah.
To keep those lessons or insights top of mind. And then, as an example, in the context of this discussion that we've had today, to advance those ideas forward to the audience, to say, hear this, consider this, right?
Right.
That's a part of the virtuous cycle as well. Yeah. So, yes, I mean, we all benefit from education and from learning, whether it's in a classroom, whether someone else mentors us, it could be a teacher, it could be a parent, it could be a neighbor, it could be a friend, whatever, right? But to bring that in and then give that back, add value in our own lives is a wonderful thing. So any final thought you want to leave our listeners?
Oh, gosh. I would just say that I would want to leave it on a positive note of having that knowledge, it's not a burden. If you love to do something, it's a positive thing. It's not going back to sustainability, which you were talking about in the previous episode, it's not a burden to have the knowledge to say, okay, I know what this is doing to the environment. It's empowering, right? You can do something about this. Even if you're doing minor things, if you're not an architect, you're not in the sustainability profession, there are still small things you can do. So let it empower you, not burden you, I guess.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Christine, for being on the show.
Thank you, Mark. Really appreciate it. This
Much
has been
appreciated.
wonderful.
Yeah, great. All
Great
right.
talking to you.
Likewise. I'm Mark Good. You've been listening to my remarkable podcast. For more episodes like this, as well as premium content, visit my site, markgood.substack.com.
And your days of trouble